The oak tree my late husband Arthur planted is the first thing I see every morning and the last thing I see every night. Its branches are like old, gnarled hands reaching for the sky, and when the sunlight filters through its leaves, it casts dancing patterns across the living room floor, the same way it did 40 years ago when we first built this house. I was standing there, watching the dust motes swirl in a golden beam, tracing the familiar grain of the hardwood with my eyes, when I felt the first chill of what was to come. It wasn't a draft from the window. It was a coldness that bloomed from within, a sudden sharp premonition that the love soaked into these walls was about to be wrung out like a dirty rag. How could a place that held every laugh, every tear, every single memory of my life be the very stage for my deepest humiliation? Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. My son Leo and his wife Serena were visiting. They didn't call it a visit, though. They called it a wellness check, a sterile, clinical term that made me feel less like a mother and more like a specimen under a microscope. Serena glided through my living room, her fingers, adorned with sharp, metallic sheened nails, trailing over my furniture, but never truly touching anything, as if she were afraid the history might rub off on her. Her eyes, a pale, calculating blue, weren't looking at the family photos on the mantel or the hand-stitched quilt on Arthur's favorite armchair. They were measuring, sizing up the space, the light, the dimensions. I saw the look, the same one a developer gives a plot of land right before they tear down the old house that stands on it. I offered them tea, the way I always did, using the porcelain cups my own mother had given me. Serena smiled, a thin, tight-lipped expression that never reached her eyes. "Oh, Clara, no thank you," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass. "We're actually trying to cut back on clutter." She gestured vaguely around the room, at my collection of antique clocks, at the overflowing bookshelves, at the very teacup in my hand. It was a small thing, a pinprick of an insult, but it landed with the weight of a stone. Clutter. She was calling my life clutter. Leo stood by the window, his back to me, staring out at the oak tree. He used to climb that tree as a boy, his pockets full of acorns he called treasure. Now his shoulders were tense in his expensive suit, his posture rigid. He hadn't met my gaze since they arrived. "The garden needs work," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a judgment. Another item on a list of my failings. I felt a familiar pang of grief, not just for Arthur, but for the boy my son used to be. The boy who would have defended his mother's home, his father's legacy. This man was a stranger in his skin. Serena walked over to Arthur's armchair, the one I hadn't let anyone sit in since he passed. The worn leather was creased and softened in the exact shape of him. She ran a single finger down the arm. "This is vintage," she said, the word hanging in the air like a bad smell. "You know, Clara, with a few updates, this house could have incredible flow. We could open up this whole wall, let in more light. It's all about modernization." Modernization. Open up the wall. The words felt like a violation. She was talking about tearing down the wall where Arthur had marked Leo's height every year with a pencil, a ladder of small gray lines that told the story of his childhood. I clutched my teacup, the porcelain suddenly cold against my skin. "This house doesn't need modernizing, Serena," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "It needs to be lived in. It needs to be loved." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I saw it. A flash of raw, unveiled annoyance. The mask had slipped. What would you have done if your own son stood there and said nothing? Do you think I was too forgiving, too quiet in that moment? Because Leo just turned from the window, his face unreadable, and he didn't defend me. He didn't defend his father's memory. Instead, he walked toward me, a sleek leather folder in his hand that I hadn't noticed before. He placed it on the coffee table between us. The sound of the leather against the wood was unnervingly loud in the silent room. "Mom," he started, and the casual word felt like a lie. His tone was different now. It was the voice he used for business, for hostile takeovers and board meetings. It was a voice stripped of all warmth, all history, all love. He looked directly at me then, and his eyes were not the warm brown eyes of my son. They were cold, hard chips of stone. He wasn't seeing his mother. He was seeing an obstacle, a problem to be managed. "Serena and I have been talking," he said, tapping the folder with a clean, manicured finger. "We need to discuss the future, your future, and the future of this property." Property. He called it property. Not home, not the house your father built, not the place where I measured you against the wall every year. The word, so cold and lifeless, hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound in the world was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against the silence. It was a sound I had loved my entire life, the steady heartbeat of our home, but now it sounded like a countdown. What's the one sound you can't unhear? The one that sliced your life into a before and an after. For me, it was the soft, slick rustle of my son opening that leather folder. The papers inside were crisp, heavy, and important looking. As he spread them on the polished wood of the coffee table Arthur and I had picked out half a century ago, the sound was obscene. It was the sound of my life being dismantled, cataloged, and prepared for demolition. Leo didn't look at me. He looked at the documents, his finger tracing a line on the top page. "As you know, Mom, the market in this area is unprecedented," he began, his voice a low, sterile monotone. It was his boardroom voice, the one I'd heard on a business channel once, and I felt a shiver of dislocation. "This plot of land is valued at nearly $50 million. He paused, as if to let the number sink in, a number that meant nothing to me. All I could hear was the word plot, another spadeful of dirt thrown on the grave of my home. Serena, who had settled into the arm of the sofa like a sleek cat, made a soft sound of agreement. A little hum in her throat that was meant to sound sympathetic, but came out as purely predatory. Have you ever looked at someone you have loved your whole life, someone you nursed through fevers and held after nightmares, and seen a complete stranger? That's what I saw when Leo finally lifted his eyes to mine. There was no warmth, no conflict, just a flat, unnerving resolution. "We've had an architectural firm draw up some preliminary plans," he continued, sliding a glossy blueprint across the table. I didn't have to look. I knew what I would see. Some glass and steel box, soulless and severe, where my garden now grew, where Arthur's oak tree now stood. It's a multi-unit luxury condominium project. The potential return is significant. I couldn't find my voice. A roaring filled my ears, the sound of blood rushing, drowning out the ticking of the clocks. My throat felt tight, as if a hand were squeezing it. When I finally spoke, my voice was a dry, rasping whisper, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. "Leo, this is my home." Serena leaned forward, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Of course it is, Clara, and we've found a wonderful place for you, a state-of-the-art assisted living community. It has a garden club and security. You'd be so much safer." Safer. The word was a slap. Safer than in the home my husband built? Safer than with the memories that held me together? I thought that was the worst of it. The casual cruelty, the prepackaged plan for my irrelevance. I was wrong. The true venom was hidden in the fine print. Leo pushed another document toward me. "We'll need your signature on this, Mom. It's just a formality, a power of attorney, granting me the ability to manage the estate's assets. It makes the transfer cleaner." I stared at the paper. The words swam before my eyes, a blur of legal jargon that felt like a foreign language. My hand trembled as I reached for it, the paper whispering against my fingertips. I wasn't looking for a loophole. I was just numbly tracing the lines, trying to connect this cold, hard reality with the sun I thought I knew. My gaze fell upon the bottom of the page, to the lines for signatures and dates, and that's when I saw it. The sound in my ears stopped. The ticking of the clock stopped. My own heart seemed to stop. The The document, this instrument of my dispossession, had already been prepared. It was dated. My finger traced the ink, the numbers stark and black against the cream-colored paper. It wasn't dated last week or last month. It was dated over a year ago. A year ago. Arthur was still alive then. He was weak, yes, confined to his bed in the room upstairs. But he was here. He was breathing the same air in this house that they were already planning to sell out from under us. This wasn't a sudden, greedy impulse. This was a long, slow, calculated betrayal, plotted and planned, while my husband, Leo's father, was taking his last breaths in the room right above our heads. There is a taste that comes with the deepest betrayals. It's not salty like tears or bitter like bile. It's the taste of ash and dust, the flavor of a world turned gray and lifeless in a single instant. That taste filled my mouth as my finger rested on the date. The paper itself felt different beneath my touch. No longer just a document. It was a gravestone, cold and unyielding. Its engraved numbers a testament to a death of trust that happened long before I ever knew I was in mourning. Have you ever held a single sheet of paper that contained the entire weight of your life's ruin? I lifted my eyes from that damning date, from that ink-black proof of a year-long lie, and I looked at my son. I searched his face, his familiar eyes, the curve of his mouth so much like his father's, and I looked for a ghost of the boy I raised. I looked for a flicker of shame, a shadow of regret, a hint of sorrow for the man who lay dying upstairs while this poison was being brewed downstairs. I found nothing. There was only a blank, impatient stillness, the look of a businessman waiting for a difficult client to stop being emotional and see the undeniable logic of the deal. The coldness in my fingers spread up my arms, a deep internal frost. "A year ago," I said. The words felt like shards of glass in my throat. They didn't come out as a question, but as a statement, a final dead fact. Arthur was still here. Serena had the audacity to sigh. A little puff of air that was meant to convey weary patience with my sentimentality. "Clara, we were trying to be pragmatic," she said, her voice dripping with condescending gentleness. "We knew what was coming. It was about planning ahead, for everyone's sake. For your sake. For my sake." The lie was so profound, so insulting, it almost stole the air from my lungs. They had stood by my husband's bed, holding his hand, offering him water, all while holding this secret like a sharpened knife behind their backs. They had comforted me at his funeral, their arms around my shaking shoulders, all while seeing me not as a grieving widow, but as the final obstacle to their $50 million payday. Leo finally spoke, his voice hard. It was a difficult time. We had to make practical decisions. Dad understood practicality. He dared to invoke his father's name. He dared to use Arthur's memory as a shield for his own treachery. That was the moment something shifted inside me. When you are pushed to the very precipice, the absolute ragged edge of your endurance, do you fall, or do you find a strength you never knew you possessed? I felt the tremor begin in my hands, but it wasn't weakness. It was a current of pure, cold rage. The grief was still there, a great hollow cavern inside me, but this new feeling began to fill it. It was ice where there had once been warmth. They saw a frail old woman, lost in her memories. They forgot I was the woman who had managed our family finances for 50 years. They forgot I had stared down doctors and contractors and bankers. They forgot I was Arthur's wife, and Arthur never, ever backed down from a fight. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the papers back on the table. My hands were steady now. I pushed myself to my feet, my joints protesting, but my spine felt like steel. I looked past Serena's shocked, perfectly made-up face and stared directly into my son's eyes. "Get out," I said. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the cavernous silence of the room. There was no pleading, no anger, just a simple, unbreakable command. Serena let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Clara, be reasonable." Leo's face hardened into a mask of contempt. He took a step toward me, his posture menacing. You don't get it, do you, Mom? He said, his voice low and dangerous. You're confused. This isn't your house anymore. The papers are just a formality. He raised his hand, pointing a finger at me as if I were a child. You will sign them. Just as the last word left his mouth, a sound cut through the tension, sharp and loud. 3 heavy, authoritative knocks echoed from the front door. We all froze. The sound was alien in the quiet of the afternoon, an intrusion from the outside world we had all forgotten existed. Leo's hand dropped. Serena's eyes darted from me to the door, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for the first time. The knocks came again, harder this time. Someone was out there, waiting. There is a strange clarity that comes after the worst betrayals. The shock fades, and you are left in a silent, brightly lit room where you can suddenly see everything for what it truly is. My son was not my son, he was a predator. My daughter-in-law was not family, she was his accomplice. And my home, my beautiful, beloved home, was nothing more than a carcass they were circling, waiting for the right moment to tear it apart. The knocking at the door was an interruption to that terrible clarity, a sound from a world that was no longer mine. What do you do when a stranger comes knocking, right at the moment your own child is trying to erase you? For a heartbeat, nobody moved. I saw the flash of panic in Serena's eyes, quickly replaced by a furious annoyance at the inconvenience. I saw Leo's jaw tighten, his gaze fixed on me as if to command me not to move, not to breathe. But the strength I had felt moments before was still there, a solid core of ice inside me. I walked past them, my steps even and measured, and opened the front door. On the porch stood a young woman with a warm, open face and a stack of pamphlets in her hand. She wore a bright blue polo shirt with a small logo embroidered on it, the seal of the local historical society. "Clara Vance?" she asked, her voice cheerful and blessedly normal. I simply nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Hi, my name is Alina," she said, beaming. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I was hoping to speak with you for just a moment about the magnificent oak tree in your front yard." I stared at her, the sheer, staggering irony of her words washing over me. A stranger had come to my door to praise the very thing my son was planning to turn into sawdust and rubble. From behind me, I could hear Serena's sharp intake of breath. I glanced back into the living room. She and Leo were standing frozen, watching us, their faces a perfect picture of strained civility. In that moment, seeing them framed in the doorway of the life they were trying to steal, a wave of grief so profound it almost buckled my knees, hit me. It wasn't for the house, not then. It was for him, for the little boy who used to hide behind that very tree, for the teenager who carved his initials into it, for the man who was now a ghost standing in my living room, wearing my son's face. Is it possible to mourn someone who is still alive? To grieve the loss of a soul while the body is still standing right in front of you? "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Alina asked, her smile faltering as she saw the look on my face. Before I could answer, Serena was there, gliding to the doorway and placing a proprietary hand on my arm. Her touch was light, but her grip was like steel. "My mother-in-law is just a little tired today," she said to Alina, her voice a sweet poison. "Thank you for your interest, but we're not available." She began to gently push me back, trying to close the door, but the ice in my veins held me firm. I looked at Alina, then at the pamphlet in her hand, which had a picture of an old, protected building on the front. "Please," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Come in for a moment. I would love to hear about your work." The look of fury Serena shot me was so potent, I'm surprised it didn't leave a burn. I stepped back, holding the door wide open, forcing her and Leo to rearrange their faces into welcoming smiles as Alina, looking slightly confused, stepped inside. The air in the room was thick with unspoken violence. As I offered Alina a seat, pointedly not Arthur's chair, I spoke about the tree. I told her how Arthur had planted it from a sapling the day Leo was born. My eyes were on Alina, but my words were for my son. Every memory I shared, every story of a tire swing or a picnic in its shade, was a stone I was laying on the scale of justice, a quiet testament to the legacy he was so eager to destroy. I could see Leo out of the corner of my eye, his fists clenched at his sides, his face a thundercloud of rage. After a few agonizingly tense minutes, Alina, clearly sensing she had walked into a war zone, made her excuses and practically fled, leaving a pamphlet on the preservation of historic landmarks on the hall table. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, Serena spun on me, her face ugly with rage. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You think that was clever? Humiliating us in front of a stranger?" But Leo was silent. He walked past his wife, his eyes locked on me, blazing with a terrifying cold fire. The pretense was gone. The boardroom manners were gone. All that was left was the raw, ugly greed. He snatched the leather folder from the coffee table, his movements sharp and violent. He crossed the space between us in 2 long strides and shoved it hard against my chest, forcing me to stumble back a step. A pen was thrust with it. "Enough games!" he snarled, his face inches from mine. "You will sign this. Now." I remember the feel of my son's hand in mine when he was a small child. His fingers, soft and plump, would curl around my index finger with a grip of absolute trust as I walked him across the street. I remember that same hand, years later, clumsy with a crayon, as he drew a wobbly picture of our family, the house, and the big oak tree. It was the hand I held when he was sick, the hand I high-fived when he won his first soccer game. You never, ever imagine that the hand you guided and cherished will one day be the instrument of your deepest pain. What do you do when the hand you taught to be gentle is raised against you, not in a nightmare, but in the bright, unforgiving light of your own home? The sound of the leather folder hitting my chest was a dull, muffled thud. The pen he had thrust at me skittered across the hardwood floor, the plastic-on-wood sound unnervingly loud in the tense silence. I heard Serena let out a tiny, sharp hiss of a breath, a sound of eager anticipation. It was the sound a predator makes right before the kill. I stumbled back from the force of his shove, my hip bumping against the edge of a side table, but I did not fall. I looked up into my son's face, into the eyes that held no recognition, no love, only a chilling, bottomless greed. And from that place of cold, clear anger inside me, I found one last word. No. It was not a shout. It was barely more than a whisper, but in that silent room, it landed with the force of a gunshot. For a second, Leo looked genuinely surprised, as if the possibility of my defiance was something he had never even considered. Then the surprise curdled into pure, incandescent rage. The crack of his hand across my face was a deafening explosion that seemed to silence everything else in the world. The ticking of the clocks, the hum of the refrigerator, my own frantic heartbeat, it all vanished, replaced by a high-pitched, piercing ring in my left ear. A strange, coppery taste filled my mouth. The shock was a physical blow in itself, a white-hot flash of disbelief that was almost worse than the stinging, radiating pain on my cheek. He had hit me. My son had hit me. Before I could even process it, before I could draw a breath, Serena's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. "She's still not getting it, Leo," she said, her tone laced with a triumphant cruelty. "She needs to understand." That was all it took. That was the final push. Leo's other hand came up, not open this time, but a fist. It wasn't a wild swing. It was controlled, deliberate, and aimed. The impact to my jaw was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The world tilted violently, the familiar patterns on my living room rug swirling into a meaningless blur. There was no pain, just a profound sense of dislocation as I fell, the ground rushing up to meet me with a final jarring crash that knocked the air from my lungs. I lay there on the floorboards Arthur had laid, my head ringing, the taste of blood now thick in my mouth. I could see them standing over me, 2 tall, dark silhouettes against the bright light of the window. There was no remorse in their faces. There was no shock. There was only impatience, Annoyance. I was an object in their way. I told you to sign it, Leo said, his voice a low growl. Then he bent down. For a wild, insane moment, I thought he was going to help me up, but his hand didn't go to my arm. It tangled in my hair, gripping a thick handful near the scalp, and pulled. A new, searing pain eclipsed everything else. He dragged me, my body scraping against the floor, my head pulled back at a brutal angle. He dragged me through my living room, past Arthur's empty chair, past the photos of our life together on the mantel. He dragged me into the entryway, where the front door still stood ajar from when Alina had fled. That's when I saw the faces. My neighbors. Mrs. Gable from next door, her hand over her mouth. Young Mr. Henderson across the street, frozen halfway through watering his petunias. They were watching. They were all watching. As he pulled me over the threshold, the rough wood of the porch scraping my skin. He leaned down, his voice a venomous whisper, meant only for me, but loud enough for the world to hear. "Get out," he spat, his breath hot on my face. "It's 50 million. He let go, and I collapsed onto the porch steps. As I lay there, gasping, humiliated, and broken, I heard the sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. I heard my son and his wife laughing. There's a strange and terrible secret you learn when you are publicly humiliated. The silence of the witnesses is a second assault. The blow from my son's fist sent me to the floor, but it was the sight of my neighbors' faces, their eyes wide with shock, but their feet planted firmly on their own perfect lawns, that truly broke me. They stood like statues in a garden of horror, unwilling to step into the frame of my nightmare. Have you ever been in desperate need of help, surrounded by people, and realized in a soul-crushing instant that you were completely, utterly alone? I lay on the rough, splintered wood of my own front porch, the world a dizzying smear of pain and bright, indifferent sunlight. I could see everything with a hallucinatory clarity, the precise pattern of a crack in the pavement, a single perfect red rose blooming in Mrs. Gable's garden, its petals impossibly vibrant against the backdrop of my gray despair. I saw her hand, still hovering over her mouth, her expression not one of sympathy, but of pure, unadulterated shock, the kind you have when you witness a car crash, a grotesque spectacle you can't look away from. Mr. Henderson had dropped his hose, the water pooling silently around his feet, his face a blank mask. None of them moved toward me. None of them spoke. They just watched. From the doorway, my son and his wife looked down at me, their laughter fading into smug, satisfied smiles. I was a problem that had been solved, a piece of trash that had been taken out. I saw Leo's eyes flick toward the neighbors, a flicker of annoyance in his gaze, not because he felt shame, but because his private business now had an audience. Then, with a final look of utter contempt, he and Serena stepped back inside. The heavy oak door swung shut with a deafening finality, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet street. It was the sound of my life being sealed away from me. The sun was warm on my back, a cruel mockery of comfort. I closed my eyes. The pain in my jaw was a dull, throbbing drumbeat. The pain in my heart was a vast, silent scream. I thought, this is it. This is the end. I am 72 years old, and I am going to die on my own front porch while the world watches. But then I heard it. A faint, unfamiliar sound piercing the suburban quiet. A siren wailing in the distance, growing steadily louder. I opened my eyes. Down the street, the statues were moving. Heads turned. A few neighbors who had been peeking from behind their curtains now stepped out onto their lawns. The sound grew, a high, urgent cry that was getting closer and closer. Then, it was here. A paramedic ambulance, followed closely by a police cruiser, swung onto our street, their flashing lights painting the houses in frantic, alternating strokes of red and blue. They slowed to a stop directly in front of my house, the sirens dying with a final, choked whimper. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the police radio. My neighbors were all staring, no longer at me, but at the impossible scene of flashing lights on our pristine, quiet block. The front door of my house opened again. Leo and Serena stepped out, their faces a perfect blend of confusion and indignation, as if this intrusion was a personal affront to them. A police officer, a tall man with a calm, serious face, got out of the cruiser. A paramedic followed, carrying a medical bag. I expected them to rush to me. I expected questions, a flurry of activity around my broken body. But they didn't. The officer glanced at me, his eyes taking in the scene in a single, sweeping look, and then he walked right past me. He and the paramedic walked up the stone path, stopping directly at the foot of the porch steps, creating a barrier between me and the two people who had put me there. Leo puffed out his chest, ready to unleash his fury on these intruders. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice booming with authority. "This is private property." The officer didn't even blink. He looked straight at my son, his gaze level and unyielding. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire street. "Leo Vance?" he asked, his tone making it a statement, not a question. "We received an emergency call regarding an assault in progress at this address." There is a moment when you are lying broken on the ground, when the world splits into two distinct sensations: the sharp, undeniable reality of your own pain, and the distant, dreamlike movements of everyone else. The paramedic's hands were gentle on my face, a stark, shocking contrast to the violence that had put me there. I could taste the metallic tang of blood mixed with the sterile, chemical flavor of an antiseptic wipe as she cleaned a cut on my lip. It was the taste of being cared for, a flavor I had forgotten. Through a daze of pain, I watched the tableau on my porch as if it were a stage play. My son, puffed up with indignation, was lying to the calm, implacable police officer. "My mother is elderly and confused," Leo said, his voice slick with false concern. "She had a fall. This is a gross overreaction." Serena stood beside him, nodding, her face a perfect sculpture of worried devotion. They were so convincing. For a terrifying second, I wondered if anyone would ever believe me. Who speaks for you when the world has already decided you are too old, too frail, too confused to have a voice? As the paramedic gently wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm, the feeling of its steady, tightening a small, grounding reality, another car pulled up to the curb. It was a simple, dark sedan, and from it stepped Alina, the young woman from the Historical Society. But she was different now. The cheerful uncertainty was gone, replaced by a quiet, formidable confidence. She wasn't carrying pamphlets. She was carrying a thin leather briefcase. She walked with a purpose that parted the gawking neighbors like a ship through water. She didn't come to me. She walked directly to the officer, who turned to her with a look of recognition. "Ma'am," he said. She nodded, her eyes briefly meeting mine with a look that was no longer just kind, but fiercely protective. "Officer," she replied, her voice crisp and clear. "I'm Alina Cardenas. I'm Mrs. Vance's legal counsel." The words hit the air and seemed to hang there, shimmering with impossibility. "My legal counsel?" Leo and Serena froze, their masks of concern shattering into pure, slack-jawed disbelief. Alina turned from the officer and knelt beside me, her movements efficient and compassionate. The paramedic gave her space. "Clara," she said, her voice low and urgent. "My name really is Alina, but I'm not with the Historical Society. I'm an attorney with the Senior Justice Project. Your husband, Arthur, contacted us nearly 18 months ago. Have you ever felt completely and utterly defeated, only to discover that someone, somewhere, was already fighting a war on your behalf?" The world tilted again, but this time it was not from a blow. It was from a wave of revelation so profound it stole my breath. Arthur. My Arthur. He had known. He had seen the darkness in our son, and had laid plans to protect me from beyond the grave. Alina's visit, the questions about the oak tree, it was all a pretense, a way to make contact, a plan Arthur himself had helped devise. The 911 call hadn't come from a frightened neighbor. It had come from Alina, who had been parked just down the street, waiting and watching, a guardian angel I never knew I had. A sob, thick with a year of unshed grief and a moment of overwhelming gratitude, tore from my throat. He had never left me. Not really. Leo finally found his voice, a strangled, incredulous squawk. That's absurd! You have no proof of anything. It's her word, a confused old woman's word, against ours. He gestured at me with a dismissive wave, as if I were a piece of faulty furniture. Alina didn't even look at him. She simply rose to her feet, opened her briefcase, and took something out. It wasn't a document. It was a small silver digital voice recorder, worn from use. She held it up so the officer, and everyone else, could see it. She looked directly at Leo, and her voice was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "On the contrary, Mr. Vance," she said, "we have your father's." She let the words sink in before continuing. "Arthur recorded a conversation with you 2 weeks before he passed. A conversation where you, believing he was too sedated to understand, detailed your entire plan to him. The shell corporations, the fraudulent power of attorney, the $50 million valuation. We have it all, in your own voice. The moment a son's betrayal is laid bare for the whole world to see, it is not a loud or dramatic affair. It is a quiet, sickening unraveling. It began with the simple sound of a button being pressed on a small silver rectangle. A sound that sliced through the stunned silence of the street. Then came the voice, a voice I thought I would only ever hear again in my dreams, filling the air with a truth so terrible it brought a monster to his knees. What does true justice sound like? It sounds like a dead man speaking. Arthur's voice came first, thin and frail from the speaker, but filled with a heartbreaking clarity. "Leo?" he had asked. And then my son's voice, thick with arrogance and condescension, so certain of his audience's weakness. "Don't worry, Dad, just rest. I'm handling everything." Alina held the recorder up, and Leo's recorded voice spun out his web of deceit for all to hear. He spoke of the lawyers who were drawing up the paperwork. He spoke of the inevitable decline and the need to liquidate the primary asset before it became a burden. He spoke of the $50 million valuation, his voice practically salivating over the number. He laid his rotten soul bare, believing the only witness was a dying man. The entire street was silent. The only sound was the recording, my son's voice confessing his sins into the sunlit afternoon. I watched his face. I saw the blood drain from it, his confident posture collapsing inward as his own words, weaponized by his father's love for me, condemned him. Serena began to tremble, her perfectly composed face crumbling into a mask of pure terror. When the recording ended, a profound silence descended. It was broken by the officer, who spoke calmly, as if reading from a script. "Leo Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and assault." The sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs snapping onto my son's wrists were the loudest sounds I had ever heard. That was when Serena finally broke. It was not a sob of remorse, but a raw, ugly shriek of a trapped animal. "He made me do it!" she screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at her husband as a second officer moved toward her. "It was all him!" As they led Leo away, his hands cuffed behind his back, he stopped. He turned and his eyes found mine. The greed was gone. The rage was gone. All that was left was the hollow, terrified gaze of a little boy who had just realized the nightmare was real. "Mom," he whispered, the word a ragged, broken thing. And in that one word, I saw the ghost of the child I had raised, and I felt a wave of grief so vast it threatened to drown me. I had won. My home was safe. But my son was lost to me forever. I had not just been victorious, I had been bereaved. Alina helped me to my feet and guided me back inside my house. The police cars, with their flashing lights and shattered family, drove away. The neighbors, their suburban drama over for the day, retreated into their homes. The door clicked shut behind me, not locking me out, but welcoming me home. I walked through my living room, the scene of such violence and cruelty, and it was already transforming back into a sanctuary. I ran my hand over the worn leather of Arthur's armchair. I looked out the window at his oak tree, its leaves rustling in the breeze, a silent, steadfast guardian. The frantic, violent sounds were replaced by the gentle, familiar heartbeat of my home, the grandfather clock ticking faithfully in the hall, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, a bird singing on a branch outside. I was safe. I was home. I learned that a home is not just walls and a roof. It is a fortress built from love and memory, a living thing that holds the echoes of every laugh and shelters you from every storm. And I learned that true love is a force so powerful, it can lay plans that reach back from beyond the grave to protect what is precious. They tried to tear down my house, but they never understood that its foundation wasn't concrete. It was a love story. My roots here are as deep and as strong as the oak tree my Arthur planted, and I will not be moved. What lesson did you take from this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that justice should always be served, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that matter.